want to go through some of the notes with you. So when we come to class, that we can really focus on some of the chapter material that we're starting now on North America. So this is going to be one that's really applicable to you because I think you're going to be just that much more familiar with the United States and Canada. And this is going to go through chapters 5 through 8. So it's going to be another extensive unit, but it's probably going to be kind of a fun one, I think. So let's get started. When you come to class, we're going to be working on some of the landforms itself, and that's really where we're going to start. And, the United States, especially in Canada as well, have really been blessed with an abundance of natural landforms. We are very, very lucky to have the resources that we do. In fact, it's what really has allowed the United States and Canada as well to become a superpower in the nation because, in the world, I should say, because of all of our natural resources. So, between the United States and Canada, the area itself makes up 1/8 of the world's land. That's a lot. That is a lot. And keep in mind these are two countries. If we compare, say, another country such as France, for instance, or Great Britain, or maybe India, we're talking a big difference. India is considered a subcontinent, and it's not even quite as large as what we have in Canada and the United States. Canada is the second largest land area after Russia. Russia expands two continents, Asia and Europe, and Canada is the second largest. So Canada is a very, very massively large country. Between the United States and Canada, we have many of the world's rivers and mountains. I mean, some of the most famous rivers and mountains are in North America. The Appalachians. We're going to talk about the Appalachians a little bit here, and you'll see it definitely on your landforms when we get into class and start working with that. But like in US history, for example, my class in APUSH, we're learning a lot about the Appalachians of what had happened in 1763 before the Declaration of Independence was signed. The Appalachian mountain chain was a really important border or barrier, you might say, in American history. The Canadian Shield is massive. I mean, something like 80 million square miles or some huge amount. And the Canadian Shield is just kind of what's the rocky type of rock that was left over a period of weathering. We're talking millions and millions and millions of years, but usually because of glaciers and ice left behind. The Rocky Mountains, I think you're probably familiar now. The Rocky Mountains stretch all the way from Canada into the United States and almost down to parts of northern Mexico as well. So the Rocky Mountains are a really important part also in American history when we realized there's more to explore coming from the east. There's more to explore on the western toward the Pacific, but how do you get over the Rockies? Now, people who had already been indigenous to this country, Native American groups who had been here for thousands of years, realized you don't just cross back and forth. Spanish settlers who were coming up from Mexico probably understood that there was something on the other side of the Rockies, but how is the best way to get around the Rockies, if you will? The Continental Divide is kind of this area that we see divides the United States into two parts. Really, anything to the west of the Continental Divide is on the other side, to the west of the Rockies, and to the east on the other side. And this is kind of a good. It even affects our climate and our weather patterns. We know that most weather, at least in the United States, moves from west to east, and it's because of the Rocky Mountains when it crosses kind of this continental divide, which literally divides our continent. The Great Lakes, I'll have you find out and identify where the Great Lakes are, and those were really important for shipping and commerce in near the New England areas to get to the Atlantic Ocean and really to get into areas of Canada as well. The Mississippi River between the Mississippi and the Missouri. I'll have you identify a lot of rivers. The Mississippi River, you know, they call it the mighty Mississippi. When you get into English and you read Tom Sawyer, I mean, the Mississippi was and is really the primary shipping river in the United States, vitally important to the economic well-being of the United States, at least up until like the 19th century. The Mackenzie River. The Mackenzie River, when I have you located on your map, it looks like this tiny little river, like it's really small. But keep in mind, Canada is the second largest country in the world, and the Mackenzie River is up in the northern part of Canada, so it's going to look really small in comparison to this gigantic country. But the Mackenzie River is over 1,000 miles long. So we have lots of rivers and lakes. We are blessed with this ability to really have civilizations. We look at ancient civilizations, and it doesn't matter where in the world, they almost always were developed around water sources, especially rivers, where you could try to control the river, you could use it for irrigation, and it allowed you to have a food supply, a constant food supply if you could grow crops. And between the United States and Canada, we have 8 of the 15 largest lakes in the world. That's pretty impressive. Things like transportation, hydroelectric power, irrigation, fresh water, fisheries, these are all things that our natural resources in the United States and Canada offer us, which again is one of the reasons why we are economically blessed in this country, because of our expansive amount of land, which contains these really rich lakes and rivers. So there again is the idea of these resources. We have an abundance of resources. We have really fertile soil. The United States is the leading food exporter here in the Midwest. We feed the world. I mean, really, we feed the world. We export a lot of food to keep the world from going hungry. We have a lot of forest that's diminishing, but we're trying to actively keep up our forest because we are a major producer of lumber. If you go anywhere in the northern part of Minnesota, if you've ever been like around Bemidji or anywhere, you definitely probably have passed by, if you didn't know it, lumber mills and timber mills where they are logging a lot of forest because people need to build houses, and we need to build buildings, and we need to repair, and we have to have paper and all these things that lumber really can do for the economy and the country. And then we have a lot of minerals. We are really blessed, and we're finding more. In the western part of North Dakota, we didn't discover that we had the kind of oil that we did until probably about a decade ago. Now, we knew that there was some oil out there, but we knew that there was not a method to get to what we are able to get to now in what's called the Bakken. And now we can do something called fracking, where we literally like crack under the earth using water typically. Now, there's a lot of controversy with this, but it also means that we do not have to rely on other countries and import oil the way maybe we used to. And when you don't have to rely on another country, that makes your government and your economy more stable. We have a lot of iron ore. If you've, again, ever been up to, and this is where, if you remember from the slide before when I talked about the Canadian Shield, the Canadian Shield is around, and I'll have you identify where the Hudson Bay is. The Canadian Shield extends way down from the Hudson Bay, even into parts of Minnesota, of northern Minnesota. And so if you've ever heard of the Iron Range, it is very rich in iron ore. We have a lot of coal, and coal for many people, even yet today, is one of the primary ways that we can produce electricity. Lots of natural gas, which you know is how most people probably heat their homes today, and oil. Oil is hugely important. North Dakota is not the leading exporter of oil, but we're definitely doing our part. So these are all really, again, these natural resources that other countries just don't have the luxury of having, which has allowed the United States and Canada to flourish the way time and history has allowed it. Climate and vegetation. Well, so you can see this picture here. You know, and right now, if you've been listening to the news, there's another round of hurricanes and tropical storms that is hitting in the Gulf area, the Gulf of Mexico. We have a lot of different climate regions. It ranges from the tropical zones, which we would consider in Florida and Hawaii, to ice caps and this kind of permafrost, which is permanently frozen ground up in the northern areas of Canada. And so we have, you know, a very wide variety of climates. Tropical zones, for instance, in Kauai, Hawaii, is the wettest spot on Earth. They get 460 inches of rain on average per year. Can you imagine that? That means they probably average more than an inch a day. Now, chances are it doesn't rain all the time every day, but that is a lot of rain. That is a very, very wet spot. And then the Florida Everglades, if you've ever heard of the Everglades. This is a huge swampland. It's 4,000 square miles, kind of down. If when we come to class, we're also going to do an activity. If you can think of how Florida is, kind of like a peninsula jutting into the Atlantic Ocean and the Gulf. The Everglades are kind of like right at the very bottom of Florida, and I'll point those out when we get to class together. So again, we have to learn how to deal with this. You know, people in Louisiana right now are trying to deal with yet another storm or another tropical storm. It luckily didn't turn into a hurricane, but that also changes the way people live and interact with their environment. You know, think about that human environment interaction. And there we go, the human environment interaction. We really have dramatically changed the face of North America in order to control the resources, to allow the resources to work for us. In some ways, that's really great. And in some ways, that's really bad. Sometimes we cannot repair or undo maybe the damage we've done. As we go along and we progress, we realize we need to take better care of our earth, but sometimes we don't do it properly, or we don't think of the long-term consequences when we're doing it. So Beringia this is how, and we're talking, you know, millions and millions of years ago. It used to be one large land mass. And so we know that some of the first human beings who lived in North America crossed over from Asia. Literally, they walked from Asia and settled into Canada and the United States over thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of years, because there used to be a land bridge. There used to be a bridge almost of land that you could walk from Asia. And this is how we see kind of the spreading of people happening over time. When Europeans came to North America, they settled usually from the western part to the east. From the eastern part to the western part. However, if you were a settler from Spain, you probably moved from the southern part of Mexico up to the northern part. So you might have started to move in northward from New Mexico, from Mexico into New Mexico, Arizona, California, Texas, some of those areas. But almost always we see people living near rivers or water, because it allowed societies to flourish. We have something called urban sprawl, and this is rather an interesting term. It's how these cities begin to expand. We see it in many different areas. The example your book gave was in Los Angeles, where Los Angeles has increased in size so much that they have an urban sprawl, and it brings about a lot of problems like air pollution. They're forced to build on earthquake-threatened land. They have a lack of water. there's a lot of things that are consequences of urban sprawl. We can see, if you ever look at a map of the United States at night, you can see how like the United States is lit up at night, and you almost always see it in in the coastlines where you can see that urban sprawl. We've changed the face of North America through canals and waterways. And that was to link rivers to oceans in order to get good transportation and increase our exports and get imports of the things that we didn't have. You had to have a transportation system, and at first that would have been through rivers. And how do you get from one place to another if there's not a river connecting those two places? Sometimes you needed to build canals and dig waterways. I'm going to have you find the St. Lawrence River. The St. Lawrence River was very important. It's what we call the St. Lawrence Seaway, and it connects the Great Lakes to the Atlantic. In order to get a lot of the goods, especially like furs and things that they were able to find around the Great Lakes area, how do you get them to the Atlantic for, at least in the European sense, to ship them back over to, say, England? Well, they figured out a way to connect the Great Lakes. One of the ways they did that was through locks. There's a really cool map on page 129 that shows you what locks are. Locks are meant to raise or lower water levels for ships to pass, and you can see that. That's a lock right there. So what they would do is, if a ship can't get past because the water isn't deep enough or something, they would like flood this area, and it would allow ships to float there. And then when the ship goes back, they would kind of lower it back down. And so this was kind of really a feat of technology and engineering and infrastructure. It's like my favorite word, infrastructure, because they realized how humans can shape the natural environment in order to make it work for humans. Always great, but sometimes it might have negative consequences as well. And then finally, I want to talk about the Transcontinental Railroad. The Transcontinental Railroad was started, it took several years to build, but it was completed in 1869, and it stretches from the Midwest all the way to the Pacific. Now, if you think about this, for many years, think about where the Mississippi River is, right? The Mississippi was what they used to get goods down into the Gulf of Mexico and to ship usually to Europe or Asia. Well, how do you get all of those resources on the other side of the Mississippi? And so they had to build a railroad. Once railways were invented and they were able to build train tracks. But you know what you have to get across, right? You have to get across the Rocky Mountains. And so this was really like another feat of engineering and American ingenuity. It was constructed mostly with immigrant workers. If you think back, do you remember reading the book about the kites and the Chinese immigrants in California? Remember they would build, and he wanted to build I wish I were with you today because you would help me remember. His dad wanted to build the airplane. Well, this is about that time, and so we see that most of the Transcontinental Railway was done with immigrant work that was very dangerous, often resulted in loss of limbs or loss of life, a lot of disease and things like that. And so keep in mind that truly immigrants kind of helped build our country. The National Highway and Interstate System. This is another, once again, amazing feat of engineering that people were able to figure out how this happens. Now, again, we have all these natural resources. We have this abundance of land, but it's the people who figure this out, how to use the land and make it work for human beings. The interstate system was started in the 1950s by President Eisenhower, and it continues today. Now, it's both a state and a federal kind of regulated system, but interstates, and I'm not sure if you can tell right here, maybe you can tell where Minnesota and North Dakota is on that map. We have two interstates that run through North Dakota. I-29, if odd, 29 is an odd number, I-29 is an odd number, so odd numbers run north and south. Even numbers run east and west. And so we have I-94 running through North Dakota. That is an even number. It runs east to west. And you can really see that throughout, it doesn't matter, all throughout the United States. You can understand how that works. We'll talk about that actually a little bit more in class when we look at cities and things as well. So, for instance, I think we talked about one day how the interstate speed limit in North Dakota is 75, but the interstate speed limit in South Dakota is 80. States get to control their interstate system. They have to maintain it. However, they get a lot of help and subsistence funds from the federal government. So that's where I want to stop for today. That was a lot of notes to take. I hope you can get all these written down, because then when we come to class, we're going to work, like I said, on these natural landforms, which has allowed Canada and the United States to really flourish. So until next time, we'll see you later. Bye.